the videotaped deposition of Dr. David Shank, taken by the plaintiff in the matter of Kevin Tolson versus St. Agnes Healthcare, Inc. et al. In the Circuit Court for Baltimore City, case number 24-C-12-008071. Today's date is February the 18th, 2014, and the time is 12:55 p.m. The deposition is being held at Hart Reporting and Video Conferencing, Harrisonburg, Virginia. My name is Karen Hart, and I'm the video specialist today. The court reporter is Kay Triglio, and we are from the firm of Hart Reporting and Video Conferencing. Counsel, will you now please introduce yourselves and state whom you represent for the record?
Rodney M. Gaston, and I represent the plaintiff Kevin Tolson.
Danielle Dinsmore, present on behalf of defendants Prudence Jackson, MD, Kruppish Shaw, PA, and Maryland Provo 1 Medical Services, PC.
This is Mary Pat McGuire, attending by telephone, and I am here on behalf of defendants St. Agnes Healthcare, Inc. and Caroline Stell, RN.
The court reporter will now swear in the witness.
You do affirm that you will tell the truth to the best of your ability. So help you God.
I affirm.
Okay. Doctor, would you please state your name and business address?
David L. Shank, 2010 Health Campus Drive, Harrisonburg, Virginia, 22801.
Doctor, the reason I've asked you to appear today for your deposition is because I've been informed by three of the defendants in this case, Physician Assistant Shaw, Dr. Jackson, and Maryland Provo 1, that you may appear at trial and present expert opinion testimony. Have you ever had your deposition taken before?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I just want to go over a couple ground rules, even though you've probably done this many times, so we can get through the deposition and have a clean record. The court reporter is here to take down my questions and your answers. Even though this deposition is being videotaped, it's important that we not talk over top of each other. So in normal communication, frequently people interrupt each other all the time. But I'll just ask if you can just wait until I finish asking my question before you answer, and I'll try to give you the opportunity to answer your question before I ask the next question. Also, if there's any question that you don't understand,
Excuse me, we're going off the record and it's 12:58 p.m. We are back on the record. The time is 12:58 p.m.
Doctor, if at any time I ask you a question and you don't understand my question, please stop me and just tell me you don't understand, and I'll try to rephrase the question. Otherwise, if you don't tell me that, then I'll assume, and we will all assume for the purpose of this deposition, that you've understood the question and that you've answered it appropriately. Are you able to follow those simple rules?
I'll give it my best shot, sir.
Thank you, Doctor.
Okay, just note my objection to what counsel will assume.
Okay. Doctor, I'll show you what's been marked as Exhibit Number 1, and I'll ask you if you've seen that before.
No, sir.
Okay. That is the notice for your deposition today, and one of the pages of the deposition asks you to bring with you a variety of documents. I've known that you have brought some materials with you today, and we'll read those into the record real shortly. But are the materials that you showed me before the deposition began all the materials that you have brought with you today?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Why don't we go ahead, and if you can simply read the titles of the documents that you have so we get a clear record of everything that you brought today.
Yes, sir. I have a set of the emergency medicine records from St. Agnes Hospital dated 12/3/09. Answers to interrogatories. I have an alternative dispute resolution office document. 12/5/09 visit to Concentra Medical Center. My certificate of qualified expert and report. The CVs of P.A. Shaw and Dr. Jackson. I have certificates of qualified experts and reports of Dr. Larson, Nurse Margison, and P.A. Nicholson. A copy of the complaint, paper copies of knee x-rays done on 12/3 and 12/5 of 09. A disc that has many x-rays on it. The only one I looked at was the knee x-ray that was done on 12/3 of 09. Records from the St. Agnes Hospital admission 12/5/09 through 12/8/09. And then I have the depositions of the following individuals. Caroline Stell, S-T-E-L-L-E. Krupa, K-R-U-P-A, Shah, S-H-A-H. Prudence Jackson. Kevin Tolson. Paul Collier. William Woodruff. Stacy Tolson, S-T-A-C-Y. Corey Tolson. Sharon Craddock. Linda Margeson, M-A-R-G-E-S-O-N. Jeffrey Nicholson. Kenneth Larson, Jr. Ragabrata, R-A-J-A-B-R-A-T-A, Sarkar, S-A-R-K-A-R. Murdad Malik, M-E-H-R-D-A-D, Malik, M-A-L-E-K, and Gregory Sachs, S-A-C-H-S.
Does that include all of the documents you brought with you today for your deposition?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Doctor, I noted by glancing through the deposition binders that there are little blue or red tabs on some of the depositions. Would that be accurate?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Can you tell me if we can go through the depositions? I don't think there's that many. If you go through the deposition, just tell me what the name of the deposition is and why you tabbed that particular page and why you feel, if you do, that that was important.
Okay.
Subject to the form. Go ahead.
Mr. Tolson's deposition on page 64, I'm sorry. He mentioned that when the incident happened, that it hit him between his legs. On the report that the EMS people wrote, there was a different history that he gave them, so that's why I placed that flag there.
Does the difference have any effect on the opinions that you reached in this case or intend to give in this case?
It certainly gives a different picture of the event during his deposition than the picture which was presented of the event from the EMS people. Prospectively is how I am reviewing from standard of care, so I am looking at what the EMS record said as being the most accurate rendition from which to develop my opinions. So yes, it does affect them.
Okay, and how so, if at all?
Because in the EMS record, they're of course the first responders. They're there on the scene. They have the patient. They have where it occurred, and they have the best look at the whole situation. And in that instance, they recorded that Mr. Tolson, that he stepped down into something, stepped down into a gate as if it's below ground level, that his foot got stuck, that his body twisted, and he fell to the ground. And so that's the picture that I have of what Mr. Tolson explained to them, how this event happened. And that's different than what is indicated in his deposition where something hit him between the legs. Those are rather different renditions of the event.
Okay, so would it be fair to say that your opinion with respect to the standard of care is going to be based upon the history that Mr. Tolson gave to the both EMTs and to the staff and doctors at St. Agnes Hospital, and not his later deposition testimony?
Correct. Those were the ones that were contemporaneously recorded, the history he gave at the time of the event. Obviously, the deposition occurred some 44 months later after that time.
Okay, go ahead, next.
On I continue on Mr. Tolson on page 173. He was asked about the pain scores that are recorded in the record, and he indicated that he did not score his pain. So I found that the contemporaneously recorded record there, where his pain level is recorded twice, is different than his recollection when his deposition was taken regarding his pain scores being asked.
And the same question, your opinions are going to be based upon the EMS record and not his subsequent deposition.
On the EMS and ER records as to what transpired at that time. Yes, sir, because at that point in time, people were simply writing down what transpired, no idea of what would happen later. And when someone writes down a pain score, those specific scores are not something that we make up or that we decide what the patient's pain is. We ask them, and when specific numbers are placed, they reflect what the patient gives as their perception of the pain. We may have a separate assessment of how much pain we think the patient is in that may or may not correlate with what they're telling us, but the numbers that are written down are the ones that are specifically provided by the patient. And as I read the record, there were at least 2 or 3 occasions where people wrote down specific numbers that reflect them asking him his level of pain.
Okay, go ahead, doctor.
Dr. Woodruff's deposition, page 24, he is speaking there about clinical matters relative to knee injuries that seem to me to exceed the area in which he has expertise and practices medicine. He is a radiologist. He is not an emergency medicine physician or one who is responsible for actually clinically evaluating injured joints.
Do you plan on giving any opinions in this case with respect to those comments made by Dr. Woodruff that you just referenced in the chart?
Not unless I'm asked.
Well, if one of the defense attorneys asks you, do you intend to give opinions in that regard with respect to what Dr. Woodruff commented on?
I'm just going to object to the form.
Yes, I'm perfectly comfortable giving the same opinion later that I'm giving you today.
Okay, and I need to know specifically, within a reasonable degree of probability in the field of emergency medicine, what your opinion is with respect to that testimony from Dr. Woodruff.
That is not the sort of medicine that Dr. Woodruff practices. Radiologists do not routinely acutely evaluate injured knees, and they certainly are very adept at providing and do provide their readings and interpretation of films, often ones we're not capable of interpreting and do not attempt to do so. But the clinical piece of that is something that we do. Radiologists really do not ordinarily participate in that part of the evaluation of the patient.
And do you disagree with his opinion with respect to the clinical piece?
Objection.
Rephrase that.
Okay,
I'm not sure what you mean.
what is the clinical opinion that you believe that's not the sort of opinions that radiologists give in cases?
I just found it unusual from my experience in interaction with radiologists to address clinical issues in that way, specifically talking about internal derangement of the knee from what he saw there.
But do you disagree with his ultimate opinion, though?
Do you want him to read the testimony?
Yeah. Why don't you read the opinion that you're commenting on, and I need to know if you agree or disagree with it.
Okay. The question was, regarding the fluid that was present and talking about lipohemarthrosis. And then the question right before this is, okay, and what, if any, significance does that mean to you as a radiologist? And the answer is, excuse me. The answer is, okay, this has a great deal of significance to me as a radiologist. This indicates that there has been, the question, to rephrase the question, if I may, is how does that combination of material get within the joint? This is specific for a significant internal derangement occurring within the knee. And the reason that I said earlier I flagged this was because you can have fluid within the knee without having a significant internal derangement. And so I was surprised to hear him give that opinion, because while it can be present with significant internal derangement, it does not mean that it is specific for. And so I disagree with that sentence of his opinion as being correct.
All right, thank you. Okay, you can continue, doctor.
I have a flag here on page 70, and I'm not quite sure why.
And if you're not sure why, then I don't know either, so let's keep going.
On page 81, bottom of the page, question, okay, and the fat comes, again speaking about the lipohemarthrosis, and the fat comes from the fracture of a bone that then is released from the bone marrow and communicates with the joint, correct? Answer, well, that's the typical, but I mean any structure that has fat that is released. I mean, for instance, a vessel disruption, the disruption of a vessel could lead to some fat release. Goes over onto page 82. I flagged that because I've never heard of blood that comes out of any arterial or venous supply contributing significant fat to an effusion that could be seen on x-ray. That clinically just doesn't make any sense, which again I think is a little outside of his area of expertise, and I think he made a misstatement. I don't think it's particularly germane to anything in this case, but I just disagreed with that from a physician point of view.
Okay, Don, go ahead.
The next blue flag is in Mr. Nicholson's deposition on page 28.
And just for the record, he's plaintiff's physician's assistant expert.
Question, and it has to do with standard of care issues, breach of standard of care that Mr. Nicholson had evidently listed. Question, the first one is, this is an ambulance arrival, not a self-arrival. That is the first red flag. Why is that a red flag? Answer, it's not a deviation, but it's a red flag. The diagnosis that was provided in this case was a knee sprain. In my experience, knee sprains without significant trauma do not arrive by ambulance. This was significant knee trauma. My experience is dramatically different than P.A. Nicholson's, in that we have people arrive all the time with knee injuries by squad who do not have a significant knee injury. And to use arrival by squad as a red flag is something that most of us who practice emergency medicine would say no red flag at all, because we see tons of people with minimal injuries arrive by squad, and simply arrival by squad is not typically interpreted as a red flag in and of itself.
Because you commented on Mr. Nicholson's testimony, he's a physician assistant. Do you plan on giving opinions with respect to the standard of care of physician assistants in this case?
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
On page 42 in Mr. Nicholson's deposition, bottom of the page, he's talking about ambulance reports, and his answer is, regarding those reports, it normally is written before the ambulance crew arrives. Yes, with the greatest amount of medical probability, ambulance report is written and handed to either the nurse or the provider when they arrive at the bay. Certainly, that may well be the experience where he works. At my institution, quite frequently the EMS people have not written the report when they arrive. It is not handed to us. They may give a verbal report to the nurse. Sometimes they do not complete the reports until they've returned to the station, and then we subsequently get it. So our experience is not the same as his, where these are routinely provided as they walk in the bay. That's not something we happen to be used to. He may well be at his institution.
And do you know what the experience is for the EMS writing and handing reports to the emergency room personnel at St. Agnes Hospital in Baltimore, Maryland?
I do not specifically know how that typically happens. I do know that at this point in the time, the reports were handwritten. They were done in triplicate. The hospital received the bottom copy, and as reflected in the initial records I was given when reviewing this case, it is totally illegible and not a single word can be deciphered.
And how do you know all this information that you just testified about?
I got a copy of the records, and when I got to the EMS report, it was totally illegible. In fact, I brought a copy of that along, and I asked for a copy I could read. I was told that it was done in triplicate. The hospital gets the last copy.
Who told you that?
I think Ms. Dinsmore did.
Okay. And do you know where have you seen the original third copy of the ambulance report?
Can you just clarify what you mean by original?
No, the one that was apparently kept in the hospital chart.
I have not seen the original of that triplicate. I've seen a copy of the original.
Have you asked to see the original?
No, sir. I asked for a copy I could read, so I really didn't care if it was what it was, as long as I could read it and make it out.
Okay. Then are you assuming that the copy that's in the hospital chart is a legible copy?
Unless somebody used a terrible copy machine, that would seem to make good sense to me, but I haven't seen it, so I obviously can't say for sure.
For the purposes of any opinions you're going to give here today, are you assuming that the legible copy of the ambulance report was contained in the original hospital chart?
Did you say legible or
Yes, sir.
illegible?
Legible. As or physician's assistants reaches that determination that there's no reason to believe that there's more than anything other than a ligamentous injury within the knee. Under those circumstances, if the patient's pain is so severe that you don't want to put the patient through significant pain, then you don't have to put the patient's knee through a full range of motion testing. Is that your opinion?
Yes, sir, because let's say we have a disruption of the anterior cruciate ligament and we have a rupture of the medial collateral ligament. Even if I make the patient do what we have to do to try to assess that, it's very hard on the patient. It causes them considerable pain, and it's not going to change one whit what my care, treatment, and follow-up of that patient are. Dr. Sackar, on page 27 of his deposition, talked about that. If you remember, he chose not to even examine the patient until he had given him anesthesia and had him unconscious. And when asked about that, he said, well, it's very difficult to do the exam, which is true, because you get a tremendous amount of involuntary muscle spasm of the 15 or 20 muscles that surround the knee, both anteriorly and posteriorly. So it's a difficult, inaccurate exam. And then number two, as he indicated in his answer there on page 27, it causes what he said a great deal of pain, which is exactly true. So in that instance, not getting any useful information that's going to change what we do and simultaneously causing unnecessary pain, it is perfectly appropriate not to do a complete exam of a knee in that instance. Splint, crutch, pain medicine, follow up with an orthopedist.
Yeah, but that decision made by the emergency room doc or the physician's assistant, before they can make that decision, then they would have to rule out other significant injuries to the knee. Would that be correct?
Objection to form and foundation.
What do you mean by other significant injuries to the knee?
Right.
What's in that category?
Any other significant injuries you can think of for a trauma to the knee, such as an injury to an artery, an injury to a nerve, a dislocation, a fracture?
Objection.
That's an entirely different kettle of fish. For instance, if there is a mechanism of injury that would be such that one should be concerned that the knee may have dislocated and spontaneously reduced, then you would need to evaluate vascular structures. It would also be good to evaluate the nervous system, the nerves in that area, although the primary ones that we're concerned about would be vascular structures at that point in time.
And if the mechanism of injury suggests a dislocation, one of the ways to determine how severe the dislocation was would be to check for stability in the knee. Would you agree?
It would be, but again, see, that's not necessary to do because the stability of the knee itself is not going to change what you do for the knee. If you're concerned that you have a knee that is dislocated acutely and spontaneously reduced, then again, your knee is not your concern. Your concern would be whether or not there are any associated vascular injuries, because the vascular injuries are what could cause morbidity and mortality. The knee injury is simply something that is going to need further follow-up develop in care later, but nothing of an acute nature like a vascular injury might.
Would you agree that one of the signs and symptoms of a knee dislocation is a disruption of the ligaments that support the knee?
Objection to signs and symptoms.
Again, that's on a continuum. And so in order, again, acutely, a knee that has a significant injury, as Dr. Sakhar acknowledged, very difficult to evaluate, causes significant pain to the patient. So there's no value in trying to evaluate that knee. If you are concerned about a vascular injury, then you address that concern, not worry about what the injury to the knee per se is.
If you're trying to figure out, in this case, whether Mr. Tolson dislocated his knee, wouldn't one of the signs of a dislocation be instability of the ligaments and supporting structures around the knee joint?
Objection foundation.
It could be, but could be is generally not how we approach these. In other words, what you do with something like this is you look at the mechanisms of injury. Now, what we know is the mechanism of injury for a knee dislocation requires high force, high energy, high velocity, high impact, high inertia. Those are the situations in which you see a knee dislocate at the time of the incident. So it requires a tremendous amount of energy because of the way the knee is so compactly and so well put together with a tremendous number of ligaments and tendons that hold it so firmly. So you have to have something really significant for that to come up on your radar as a physician's assistant or a physician to be concerned about that possibility even happening. In this instance, his mechanism of injury is outlined very nicely in the report by the EMS people and the subsequent histories of hospital. Then vascular injury is not even on your list for this gentleman and is not something that you would need to rule out.
So in this case, your opinion is, based upon Mr. Tolson's clinical presentation and the mechanism of injury that is described in the ambulance report, that the doctors did not have to consider a vascular injury in this case?
And including that, the records from the ER, absolutely they did not need to include out a vascular injury because the mechanism of injury here is not what we see with knee dislocations that spontaneously reduce. You are correct. That is my opinion.
Now, knee dislocations occur 5 ways. Posterior, where the femur goes to the back. Anterior, the femur goes to the front. Lateral to the side, medial to the side, and a rotational injury, correct?
Yes, you did that very well.
Okay. Now, in this case, Mr. Tolson reports that his body twisted and he fell to the ground, that all the pain is in his left knee. Does not that suggest a twisting injury?
Objection to form. Go ahead.
Certainly the word twist is there, but this sounds like a common kind of knee injury, sir, that we see literally hundreds of times every year in the ER. I mean, people twist their knee all the time. They twist their knee skiing, they twist their knee going down steps, they fall. So that's a very common kind of injury that we see routinely. That's why mechanism of injury is so important and why this sheet was very, very helpful, because there's nothing here and there's nothing in the ER record that even comes close to being the kind of mechanism of injury that causes a knee dislocation in an otherwise healthy knee.
But do we agree that from the ambulance report, there is a report of a twisting injury to his body that at the end resulted in pain in his left knee? Can we agree with that?
We can, but it needs to be kept in the context of this entire report.
I understand.
Because, you know, he stepped down into something, his foot caught, body twisted, and he fell. None of that comes anywhere close to the mechanism of injury that we would expect to produce a vascular injury.
Okay.
And so that's why my opinion that given this and the records from the hospital, there simply is nothing there that even comes close to the kind of history that we would hear from a patient that would make us concerned about a vascular injury.
Would a full orthopedic evaluation have helped to determine the severity of the injuries to the ligaments inside of Mr. Tolson's knee?
Objection to foundation.
Are you talking about at the time of his original visit?
Yes, sir.
An orthopedist will not come to the ER to evaluate this sort of a patient if we ask them.
Maybe we're not on the same page. An orthopedic evaluation performed by a physician's assistant or an ER doctor, would that have been helpful to determine the severity of the ligamentous injuries to Mr. Tolson's left knee if it was done in the ER on December 3rd, 2009?
Objection to form and foundation.
I understand what you mean. Virtually impossible to do in a patient with an injury like we subsequently know Mr. Tolson had for the reasons I listed before, which Dr. Sarkar acknowledges. Very difficult to do because it's so inaccurate. This patient was somewhat obese. He had a BMI of 36, so that always means extra soft tissue in the area. We know there was external swelling. That was noted by several people. We know that he had an effusion, so there is internal issue as well. Effusion being much like putting a pencil in a door and then trying to shut it. It reduces the range of motion. We know that he has an acute injury, and we know that an acute injuries cause severe involuntary muscle spasm. So when you think about those 5 factors, they seriously limit your exam in terms of its authenticity. As Dr. Sarkar said, makes it very difficult. It's hard to tell for sure what you're finding, and it causes the patient extreme discomfort. So again, the dividing point is mechanism of injury and what you do with that based on the mechanism of injury.
Did you see the MRI report of December 9th, 2009 that was taken at University of Maryland Hospital that showed all of the internal derangements inside of Mr. Tolson's left knee?
I did not see that report. I, of course, read about it in some of these depositions.
And what is your understanding of the severity of his injury to the internal structures of his left knee?
Objection to foundation.
My understanding from reading in these depositions was that there was severe internal derangement of his knee.
Now, if the physician's assistant and emergency room doctor had performed an orthopedic evaluation of Mr. Tolson's knee and performed the range of motion testing, full range of motion testing, to include checking for knee stability, do you believe, in light of the injuries that we know he sustained to his knee in this case, that the findings on examination would have shown knee instability at that time?
I'm going to object because you haven't laid a foundation. You laid a foundation. He didn't even see the report, much less the imaging. So I don't think that's a fair question, but you can answer if you can.
All right, I'll give it a shot, and if I don't address everything you asked, that was a long question, so I might miss some of the part. Well, first of all, I disagree a bit with your preamble, and they did an orthopedic evaluation, I think to the extent they were able, but it wasn't a full evaluation of the knee as we think about stressing. But the knee certainly was evaluated. I think to have tried to evaluate beyond what they did would have been difficult, if not impossible, and would have been extremely painful for the patient. And there really was no rationale to do so based on the previous things I've gone over with you relative to how we divide out on mechanism of injury where we go with our evaluation.
All right, but you haven't answered my question.
Okay, try again then, because I thought it was.
My question was, you now understand the severity of the injury to the internal structures of Mr. Tolson's knee, correct?
I
Objection.
understand it based on what I've read in other people's depositions that they said it said.
Right.
That's how I understand it.
Did you want to see the MRI report from December 9th, 2009?
No, sir, because number one, I cannot read an MRI of the knee, and number two, it is not germane to opinions regarding the standard of care in a prospective fashion for Mr. Tolson.
But you have read MRI reports before, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you understand the language that the radiologist uses in MRI reports with respect to anterior cruciate ligaments, posterior cruciate ligaments, tearing, stripping, destruction of ligaments, correct?
Yes, sir.
Objection.
Okay. And the reason that you didn't want to see that, because I think in your opinion, it didn't matter in this case, correct me if I'm wrong, if every single ligament and tendon in his knee was destroyed, that wouldn't affect the opinion that you have in this case regarding the standard of care for Ms. Shaw and Dr. Jackson. Is that
Objection
correct?
form.
Well, I'm going to answer your question, but I have to rephrase a
Yeah.
couple of things you said. Number one, it wasn't that I didn't want to see it. If it would have been sent to me, I would have looked at it. I didn't say, don't send it to me. It just wasn't germane to what I was asked to do. So if it came, it came. If it didn't, it didn't. I didn't think it was relevant to my rendering opinions about the ER care. And number two, it's not that I didn't care about Mr. Tolson's knee. That was sort of phrased like I'm a
No,
callous
that's not
guy.
what I meant.
I don't
What
think you
no,
meant
let me
that.
let me go back. I didn't mean
Okay.
to suggest that.
Okay.
What I meant to say, in your evaluation, it didn't matter whether every single ligament and tendon and structure in his knee was destroyed for the opinions that you were going to give in this case. Would that be a fair
I'm just
statement?
going to object to your characterization of his injury.
Understanding what you've told me you mean as opposed to how it sounds, it is true that the injury to his knee is not germane to my opinion in this case because they're directly tied to mechanism of injury, and that's what we use to determine what we do in the emergency department on an acute basis.
Now, how does was the emergency room doctors required to rule out dislocation?
Objection.
Not if there's not a mechanism of injury that would suggest that as a possibility, and there simply was no mechanism of injury here to suggest that as a possibility.
Was the energy sufficient to cause a bone fracture?
Objection.
It could have been the fall as well. When he fell, that could cause a fracture, and that's why, as was done in this case, we do plain films to see if there's a fracture.
And is that energy that's sufficient enough to cause a fracture of a large bone in the leg also adequate enough to cause a dislocation?
Typically no, because we see hundreds of fractures of tibia, fibula, etc. without any evidence of vascular injury. Again, the setting is very important about mechanism of injury because it's high energy. It's something that had a lot of impact, a fall from a height, motor vehicle accidents, those sorts of things, and his mechanism of injury does not fit in that category.
Let me ask the question again. Is the energy sufficient enough in this case? Could it have caused a dislocation of his knee?
Extremely unlikely. Now,
Could it?
I could never say impossible because obviously very unusual things happen. But in emergency department, what we're required to do is meet the standard of care. We're required to do what is reasonable and prudent. It's not always make sure that not everything possible could happen. It's to do what a reasonable and prudent physician would do. And so that's why we use things like mechanism of injury, which is a common thing that all of us use and refer to help us do things that are consistent with what our colleagues would do elsewhere.
What are the signs and symptoms of a dislocation for a person whose knee's been dislocated outside the ER, has reduced, or in layman's terms, went back into its normal anatomical position before the patient arrives at the ER?
Do you want a sort of broad brush? Do you want me to assume there is or is not any vascular injury? What kind of, there's a lot of variables here. I'm not quite sure what you're assuming in your question.
Well, what I'm trying to find out is, for a situation where a patient has sustained a dislocation to his knee, it has reduced before he arrives at the ER, what are some of the signs if an emergency room doctor like yourself thinks there may be a dislocation? What do you look for in that patient?
Sure. Initially, you would simply look at and palpate the knee because you may well have a lot of swelling, although you don't necessarily have to, which is what makes all this very tricky and difficult at times. Because, for instance, if you rupture the capsule, then where you get a lot of swelling and effusion, it may all dissipate into the muscles. So a very badly injured knee may not look that injured. You would attempt, to the extent the patient will allow, to examine the knee in terms of stressing the knee. You would look and check the neurovascular status of the knee, distal to the injury, to see if there's any evidence of anything amiss. If you were concerned that there had been a dislocation that had spontaneously reduced, then you could listen over the area posterior to the knee because sometimes you can hear a thrill with an injury to the artery. You may see an expanding lesion that is is or is not pulsatile, posterior portion of the knee, again secondary to a vascular, specifically an arterial injury. You would check for distal pulses and compare them to the other side. You would check for the temperature and for the warmth of the structures in the lower leg and the foot that are distal to where the injury might have occurred. And of course, you would do an x-ray as well, plain film to start, because initially sometimes, particularly in someone who is obese or overweight, you can have a knee that is partially dislocated, that is not evident looking at the knee simply because there are enough structures externally that it's impossible to be sure what might be present internally. So you would do a plain film as well to see if it gave you any evidence of a partial dislocation that may not be evident externally.
Would it be fair to say that a plain film x-ray that does not show a current dislocated knee in the hospital doesn't mean that the knee wasn't dislocated before the patient arrived at the hospital?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. All right. And you said listen for a thrill?
Yes, sir.
Can you explain that for me?
Yes. If you have an arterial injury and then you have an aneurysm, a pseudoaneurysm or a real aneurysm, and you have turbulence in blood flow, then listening with the stethoscope, you can hear that turbulence that should not be there under normal circumstances. Some people might say a thrill or a bruit, B-R-U-I-T.
Now, I read in some emergency medicine textbooks that a dislocated knee is a limb-threatening emergency. Would you agree with that statement?
Up to the Foreman Foundation as to what you read.
If you have had one or still have one, I would agree it has the potential to be a limb-threatening. It may not turn out to be, but it certainly has the potential to be.
And that's because in a lot of knee dislocations, there is a resulting injury to the popliteal artery. Would you agree with that?
There's injury to that and other things. Certainly the thing we are concerned the most about is the popliteal artery. Depends on who you read. Some people say that with dislocations, 25% have a popliteal artery injury. Some say 50%. There's various and sundry things in between. What we don't know are the ones who didn't have an injury enough to cause a problem. So we never know those were injured. It seems that the ones that have a problem enough that they come to further medical attention, probably reasonably somewhere between 25 and 35%. That is high enough, and it is a significant enough location that with a dislocated knee that we certainly want to evaluate the integrity of the popliteal artery.
Is a deformity of the knee a sign of a dislocated knee?
Objection to Foreman
Again,
Foundation.
we're on this continuum. You know, is a deformity a little bit of swelling, or does it truly mean it looks like things are completely out of joint? So I reckon if you define deformity for me, I could tell you what I think about it.
Right. And in this case, the triage nurse noted deformity in Mr. Tolson's leg, correct?
She did. I saw that.
Now, are you assuming that the deformity wasn't in his knee for the opinions that you're giving in this case?
Objection.
If I recall correctly, in her deposition, she said that he had discomfort in his entire leg, and when she was specifically asked where was the deformity, she could not tell you. So if she doesn't know, I certainly have no idea where she noted a deformity.
If the deformity was in the location of the knee, would that suggest to you a possible dislocation?
You have to define the deformity, he said.
Well, doctor, the nurse didn't define the deformity in this case, did she?
She didn't, and that's
No.
why you and I are having trouble talking
Well,
about it.
but you were able to reach your opinion that there was no sign of a knee dislocation. There was no evidence of a knee dislocation from the mechanism of injury, correct?
Yes, sir.
That's your opinion.
Yes, you
Now-
correctly restated it. Now
Now-
we're okay.
When you saw the word deformity in the triage, did you question whether or not the deformity was in the knee or some other portion of Mr. Tolson's leg?
I wondered where it was and had no idea where it was. And
Did
when I'm sorry, when I read her deposition, I didn't get any information to help me.
But if the deformity had been in the knee, and it was significant, it was described as a significant deformity, would that raise the question of whether or not Mr. Tolson had a dislocated knee?
Objection to Foreman Foundation.
If the deformity If the deformity were of a soft tissue swelling nature, then it wouldn't bother me at all. If the deformity was where the upper leg was here and the lower leg was here, or vice versa, then that would concern me. I don't think that was present because we do have plain films, and the likelihood of it spontaneously reducing with him there in the ER while he was there, that would have been an event that he most certainly would have talked about or somebody would have noticed. So I can't say it's absolutely impossible. I think it's very unlikely that that note of a deformity meant there was a knee dislocation.
So you have, in reaching your opinions, you've determined that the deformity that was noted by the triage nurse was not a deformity either caused by or current deformity depicting a knee dislocation. Would that be correct?
Well, now, if there's soft tissue swelling, that could have been caused by a knee dislocation, and then we go back to mechanism of injury again in terms of what we do. So when you include both of those in there, then I have to talk about that part first. In terms of there being one literally present acutely in the ER, I don't think that that was present.
And do you know what happened with that deformity? Because no other medical provider noted that on the chart.
Objection.
Objection, Foundation, mistakes, go ahead. Objection,
Well,
Performance Foundation.
It depends what the triage nurse meant by that deformity, because P.A. Shaw did notice that the patient had swelling.
Swelling.
So by swelling, if that's what you mean by deformity, again, you know, the word deformity is sort of like a lot of other words that are very difficult to know what they mean unless whoever wrote them can explain it. And the triage nurse was unaware of exactly what she meant.
And there's no way to know whether or not that deformity actually was a complete or partial knee dislocation that was present when he arrived at triage or not. There's just no way to know one way or the other.
Objection, that misstates his testimony.
Are you asking with a 100% certainty? Is that?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, with a 100% certainty, I don't think anybody would be foolish enough to try to answer that question. In terms of knowing what knee dislocations look like, and when they go back in place, the kind of thunk they make and the discomfort that the patient notices and those around them are acutely aware of, and knowing that there were people in the room with him most of the time, either medical personnel or family, I think the likelihood this represented a dislocation while he was in the ER is just extraordinarily tiny, but I wouldn't say it was zero.
Now, is effusion, joint effusion, a sign of a knee dislocation?
Well, it can be, but a knee effusion can be present with anything from a minor sprain to a debilitating derangement of all the ligaments. So it's what we call a non-specific finding. You have to put it in the context of everything else to know what it means. So in and of itself, effusion means you might have a mild sprain. It means you could have a knee that you're never going to be walking on again.
But it's still consistent with a knee dislocation, is it not?
I wouldn't say consistent with. In my mind, consistent means you have a context that makes it more likely than not. If you take just effusions, a vast majority of effusions are going to have nothing to do with a significant knee injury that involves vascular structures. That's going to be a very, very tiny subset. So the vast majority of effusions that an emergency medicine physician would see would have to do with sprains and lesser knee injuries, not with something of the nature we know Mr. Tolson eventually was found to have.
So the effusion that he had in his leg, is it consistent or inconsistent with all the torn ligaments that we know he actually suffered in this case?
Objection to Foreman Foundation.
With one slight change. I think I know what you meant. You said effusion in his leg. I think you meant effusion in his knee.
Yes, sir.
With effusion in his knee could represent anything on that continuum.
To include a knee dislocation, would you
It
agree?
could.
Okay.
Given the mechanism of injury, very unlikely. But it could if you're just talking about it naked and take it out of context with everything else that's involved.
Now, according to Ms. Shaw's description of the mechanism of injury, an overhead door came down and struck him on his knee. Did you understand that to be her testimony?
Well, yeah, you said exam first and then you switched to testimony because there's a little bit of difference.
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I recall from either Ms. Shaw and or Dr. Jackson's testimony that the mechanism of injury that Mr. Tolson related to them as to what they understand it to be is an overhead door came down and struck him on his knee. Is that your understanding?
Yes, it's my understanding they both thought that it was an overhead door or a door of some sort that struck him on the knee. The history that Ms. Shaw had was that the left leg got caught up in a barrier door. Again, in a door kind of thing, and most of us think of doors as coming down, going up, or opening and closing kind of thing. And they both indicated in their depositions that their understanding was that a door had somehow impacted his knee.
Now, but we don't know what position he was standing in when the overhead door struck his knee, correct?
No, that is not detailed.
And we don't know how heavy the door was.
We do not.
And we don't know from their description what happened to his body after the door struck his leg, correct?
Correct.
Now, have you, from that description, also concluded that that mechanism of injury could not have caused any dislocation?
I don't have enough details there to be as confident as I am when I have this EMS report, because that does give me more detail about what transpired. And clearly, based on the EMS report, when I put it with what they have here as well, then the mechanism of injury to cause a knee dislocation is not present.
I'm sorry,
Yeah,
I didn't mean to.
I sort of paused. That was my fault. The other thing that to keep in mind, I think, is shock trauma is very close to St. Agnes geographically. And rescue squad personnel are very acutely aware if they think that something represents a significant injury that might threaten life or limb, they take those people to the highest level of care that's immediately available in this area. So I think we have to keep in mind, again, the whole context in which Ms. Shaw and Dr. Jackson are making decisions. EMS has picked this gentleman up. They're very close to Maryland shock trauma. They didn't find something based on their initial history they received or their exam of the patient that made them think the patient should go there as opposed to a couple minutes away to St. Agnes. And it's not that we use the EMS people's decision making to make our decisions, but it is certainly a factor that we do use in the whole thought process. I might also note on an EMS report, initially they did not record an evaluation of the knee. They did later add down there at the bottom of the addendum where they said there was some swelling. They evidently came to the conclusion that this injury was unlikely one of a serious nature, because at shock trauma we're all well aware of not only their local and state reputation, but their national and international reputation for taking care of significantly injured individuals, including extremity injuries. And so they brought the patient there, obviously having arrived at the conclusion in their minds that this was not something that was of a limb-threatening nature. Then the continued history we have here, obviously Mr. Tolson has the opportunity when asked what happened to give whatever history he can and is able to give relative to his injury. The history that he gave there, they got the impression this was a door that he was injured with, somewhat different than the picture we get what he told the EMS people.
Now, Doctor, do you know the protocols for the EMS people in Baltimore City?
Objection to the term protocols, but you
What do you mean by, do I generally, have I read their protocols? No, sir.
I'm trying to figure out, how did you reach the conclusion that the EMS people knew the injury wasn't severe enough to take the shock trauma?
That's what he just explained, but go ahead.
Because it's the same here in Virginia. Our EMS people, for instance, with Charlottesville, the relationship is the same. If they arrive at a scene and find a patient who has an injury that is life or limb threatening, then they simply take that patient, or have them taken, if it's in our case sometimes a helicopter is used because they can come and go quicker than the ambulance can, or if the ambulance is there, then they take the patient to the highest level of care that is immediately available for what they perceive to be an injury that's life or limb threatening. So that's pretty much standard procedure in other than Maryland.
Are EMSs in Maryland supposed to take patients with dislocated knees to shock trauma versus a closer local hospital? Do you
Objection
know?
to Fordham Foundation.
Objection.
When they're minutes apart, like St. Agnes and shock trauma are, I would be really surprised if EMS people wouldn't take either a dislocated or what they thought had been dislocated. It would surprise me greatly if they didn't take that straight to shock trauma.
Do you know if they're required to or not?
I don't know if they're required to. It would surprise me greatly if they didn't, just common sense.
Did you need to know one way or the other if they're required to take a patient that they believe had a dislocated knee to shock trauma or St. Agnes for the opinions that you're going to give in this case?
I'm just going to object to your assumption or suggestion there's some sort of written requirement that you can answer.
No, not, because again, I'm trying to think of the entire picture that we see, not just pick out one little thing. So I wouldn't rely on that one thing. to come to any of my conclusions. But I think it is reasonable when you look at the entire context of things, because in the back of ER physician, PA's mind, they know that EMS people are the first responders. They're on the scene. They get to see things that we don't get to see, that we only hear happen. And so we know that they have done an initial screening, so to speak, of patients and their injuries. Do we rely on that to make our decisions? No. But it is part of our thought process about what's already happened.
But
yes.
in this case, have you relied upon that determination made by the EMS in part for the opinions that you reached in this case?
It certainly contributed to in that it flows with and makes sense with everything else you see that transpired. But in and of itself, it would not be an adequate basis upon which to form any opinions.
But was it a part of the opinion?
Yes,
Okay.
a part.
Thank you. We'll
That
take
would
a
be
break.
fair.
We'll take a break.
We need to go change the tape at this point. The time is 1:56 p.m. This is the end of disc number 1, and we are off to
Do you
the
need
record.
a recess, a brief